My name is Eddie Bohan. I am the curator at the moment of the Irish Pirate Radio Archive in Dublin City University. I've had a love of pirate radio since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. Probably from the first time I could listen to radio, the first thing I listened to was Radio Dublin. But I have had a love of pirate radio ever since, and I've been archiving both pirate radio history and the history of the stories of those people who were involved in pirate radio. Again, the golden era of pirate radio was 40 years ago, so like myself, nobody's getting any younger. So a little presentation before Peter's brilliant documentary. You will love it. A quick question first of all. How many people still listen to radio? With hands. Oh my God. And how many people remember pirate radio in Limerick? So let me first start by defining what pirate radio is. Pirate radio is the illegal use of a radio frequency without government sanction or license. It's referred to as free radio, clandestine radio, bootleg radio, offshore pirate radio, or just simply illegal broadcasting. Ireland has had a colourful history of pirate radio broadcasting from the earliest days of the state. In every decade since 1900, pirate radio in Ireland has made the headlines. In 1916, during the Easter Rising, rebels bypassed both the laws of Britain and international wireless laws of the day by illegally broadcasting communiques signed by Pearse, Connolly and Plunkett, which meant that Ireland became the first nation in the world to be declared by radio. You'll find the untold story of that in my book, Rebel Radio. That's the only plug I'm going to do tonight. During the Second World War, or the Emergency as it was known in Ireland, an IRA pirate station in Dublin exercised the minds of both the De Valera government and the nation. The station was raided, and one of those convicted of broadcasting was a man called Sean McNeil from Mayo, along with James Plunkett, who was the brother of Joseph Plunkett, who was executed in after the 1916 Rising. McNeil would become the first man in the world to die on hunger strike, having been convicted of pirate radio broadcasting. In the 1960s, with the increased availability of cheaper transistor radios and a youth generation rebelling against the norms, pirate radio moved to a new level. And we go back to 1916 again, because the grandson of the 1916 rebel, D. O'Rahilly, struggling to get an artist that he managed airtime for a new single, ignored the rejections of the BBC and Radio Luxembourg, and Ronan O'Rahilly, in the County Louth port of Greenore, fitted out a converted passenger ferry as Radio Caroline, broadcasting from the North Sea. Caroline would later have a second ship anchored off the coast of the Isle of Man and became extremely popular in Ireland. Homegrown pirates began to appear. Industrious young engineers were building crew transmitters, going on late at night or for a couple of hours on a Sunday. Radio Melinda, Radio Sheila, Radio Vanessa in Dublin, Radio Juliet in Cork, Radio Caroline North in Monaghan were all broadcasting in the late 1960s. Now you might notice that all of these stations had female names. It was often the case that the operator would name the station after his girlfriend. And I spoke to a number of these women who had the honour of having a station named after them. And they would tune in on a Sunday morning and be quite surprised that suddenly Radio Maureen was now Radio Mary, and she had been unceremoniously dumped. So how important was pirate radio in Ireland? Without pirate radio, neither U2 or Daniel O'Donnell would be the phenomenal successes they are today. Both artists have acknowledged this. When U2 were formed, Ireland of the late 1970s and early 1980s was a dull, black and white society. But with the help of pirate radio, initially in Dublin and then later across the country, colour was introduced. When U2 were starting out on their road to stardom, access to the airwaves was limited. RTE Radio 2, which had begun in 1978 to counteract the growing power of pirate radio, had limited airtime, especially for new Irish acts and certainly not for new Irish rock acts. It was left to the rock shows and pirates like Capital Radio, Big D and ARD to promote and continually plug U2, taking them to the megastardom they got today. From 1926 onwards, first as 2RN and then Radio Éireann, state broadcaster was seen as being very Dublin-centric, and probably still is today, with only the occasional broadcast from rural Ireland. Local festivals in villages and towns across Ireland began to wire their towns with loudspeaker systems. These are two from your own locale, Newcastle West and Croom, from 1974. So they set up likes of Radio Killorglin, Radio Westport, Radio Newcastle West, and even Radio Limerick, beginning in 1972. Much of the publicity surrounded an Irish Abbey actress named Mary O'Malley, who was announced as the Announcer of the Week. Probably something you've probably seen on Sale of the Week or Sale of the Century. You can see the picture there is of, you probably know, Mickey Mac, Michael McNamara, and as you can see from some of the newspaper reports, Michael McNamara was director and producer of the station in 1972. He must have been just still out in nappies. RTE saw an opportunity to provide these festivals with a proper radio station, a mobile service that toured the country, broadcasting for a couple of hours for about 4 or 5 days per week, the duration of a festival. They were here in Limerick on multiple occasions as Radio Limni from 1976. Both these local festival stations and community stations generated an interest in radio outside Dublin, and this allied with an inertia to pass new legislation to provide for community and local radio made pirate broadcasting both affordable and profitable. On multiple occasions, hours after the RTE mobile station had departed the town or village, a pirate station would immediately appear on the air. This was accelerated by a loophole that was found in the 1926 Wireless Telegraphy Act, which would embolden pirate broadcasters. So the Wireless Telegraphy Act basically told people that it was illegal to broadcast, and it is still illegal to broadcast without a licence, but that the maximum fine was £50. Now, it probably sounds little or nothing today, and in fairness, it was little or nothing then. That was the maximum fine. So this is Big L's advertisements from 1981. And when they were rated and they were fined £50, it equated to 6 15-second spots. And that was it. And that's all they had to pay. The Act had a maximum of £15 and the confiscation of their equipment. But the loophole meant that if you were rated and managed to remove the all-important crystal from your transmitter, you could say that the transmitter, the equipment, the rest, the record decks, the mixers, microphone, could all have been used for educational or training purposes, and therefore it wasn't broadcasting. So once you removed the crystal, you were able to claim your money back, or claim your transmitter back, and all you had to do was put your crystal back in. They could still be fined. Once they got their transmitter back, it was grand. But the thing was, in some raids, and it happened in 2 Dublin stations, when the Department of Post and Telegraphs raided the station and took away their transmitter and their equipment, when they returned them to the station would say, well, you've damaged my record players, I need new record players. And the Department of Post and Telegraphs would have to pay up. So stations were getting new equipment instead of old equipment. The political instability of the 1980s, if you can have anybody around, remember there was lots of general elections in the 1980s. Pirate radio began to satisfy a demand for local representation, local stories and local voices on the airwaves. Stations were beginning to push out the boundaries of pirate radio. They were broadcasting for longer hours, playing new bands and even presenting current affairs programmes, all challenging the monopoly of RTE and the resolve of the government. Pirate operators were generating millions in ad revenue, denting RTE's coffers, and they were also employing hundreds across the country in a fledgling radio industry. Many stations were, however, still broadcasting as hobby pirates, amateurs in nature, but were still providing a local service with ads from local businesses who could never afford to advertise with the national station. In 1980, with the arrival in Dublin of 2 former Radio Caroline DJs, known on the ship as Robbie Dale and the very imaginative Spangles Muldoon, who were working at the time for another Irishman, Ronan O'Rahilly, Radio Caroline, Pirate radio, with its amateur presenters, crude homemade medium wave transmitters, was transformed by what became Robbie Robinson and Chris Carey, the real names are Robbie Dale and Spangles Muldoon, into a golden era of pirate radio. Professional, profitable and groundbreaking. Carey's Nova was extremely popular, achieving 50% listenership in Dublin. 25% listened to Sunshine, and the other 25% was divided between the smaller pirates and RTE. Carey planned to broadcast on long wave into Britain on a frequency that had been allocated to RTE. And he also briefly set up a pirate television channel. In 1983, when Carey's Radio Nova was raided because he got too big for his boots, Carey was fined £50, the maximum, which equated to the price of 2 20-second ads. And, of course, his equipment was returned. Pirate radio boomed across the country, from the super pirates like Radio Nova and Sunshine, ERI, to local community stations, to small villages, with a hobbyist entertaining the locals. At the height of the power of pirate radio in Ireland in the mid-1980s, on any one day, there were over 200 pirate radio stations broadcasting in Ireland. I've catalogued between 1926 and the year 2000 over 1,300 pirate radio stations in Ireland. And how times have changed. I think Lee mentioned a pirate transmitter in a biscuit tin. That's what's on the left. Declan Meehan, who was a famous DJ in Dublin, he had a very famous breakfast show on Radio Nova called Decky Wecky's Brecky Trecky. He was working for RTE Radio 2. He had left the Pirates because he was a good DJ. RTE 2 signed him up. And he was in RTE, and one morning he was doing the breakfast show. Again, they were piggybacking on his success because he was a breakfast DJ. He said it was 10 before the top of the hour, which was 10 to 8. And when the show was over, he was brought into the programme director of 2FM at the time and told, you can't say that. It is 10 minutes to 8. You can't say 10 before the hour, or the top of the hour, or 10 after the hour. You have to say 10 to 8, 5 to 8, 5 past 8. And Declan, within a day, was leaving 2FM and joined Radio Nova. Chris Carey knew exactly what he was getting. And he paid for Declan, and at the time Declan's girlfriend, to all expenses paid trip to LA, to an apartment or condo that Chris Carey owned, and told Declan that all he had to do was lie by the pool every day for 7 days and listen to breakfast radio in Los Angeles, and to come back and recreate it. And when he came back, Decky Wecky's Brecky Trecky was born and became the most successful, to this date, judging on the amount of advertising revenue it generated, the most successful show ever on Irish radio. But he's pictured here with a transmitter built in a USA biscuit tin. It was built by a man called Sean McQuillan from Monaghan, and was used for a radio station called Radio Butty, which was owned by the writer Pat McCabe, who went around festivals reading out his books using the pirate transmitter. If you look closely, you can even see the fan. There's a small fan in it to keep it cool. Up on the top right hand side is the transmitter, a fairly crude medium wave transmitter, belonged to Radio City in Cable Street in Dublin. So that's what you were dealing with. And on the bottom right hand side is Chris Carey's Radio Nova 10 kilowatt FM transmitter, imported from Texas in the United States. Remember, this is still illegal pirate broadcasting. But this is what they're dealing with. So, what of Limerick? You'll hear shortly about a true pioneer of pirate radio, but his legacy are the pirates that began decades later, whom he generously supported. And if you saw my slide earlier on, I talked about 10 shillings. The reason he put his station on the air was a 10 shilling bet that he could get on the air. You'll hear more about him later. The first station to appear in what was perceived as the golden era of pirate radio was Capital Radio Limerick. Capital began broadcasting from studios on Upper Catherine Street on 265 and was launched on June 19, 1978. But within days of going on air, Their studios were vandalised. They managed to get themselves back on air. But on the 28th of July, they were raided by the Department of Post and Telegraphs and the Gardaí. The following day, in an act of defiance, up on your left-hand side, which is the capital moves ahead, they took out a full-page ad in the Limerick Leader, promoting both their staff and the fact they were moving to new studios. Not mentioning, of course, that the studios they were leaving had just been raided. The station remained on air until October 1978. In November 1979, at the court case that resulted from the raid, the judge applied the Probation Act when he heard that the station had closed. One of the main operators behind the station was Jerry McNamara. Next in the air was the very short-lived Radio Limerick Weekly Echo, R.L.W.E, broadcasting on 253 metres. R.L.W.E opened on the 17th of July 1978 from studios located above the Limerick newspaper. The station, like the predecessor Capital, was raided on August 9th and returned briefly on the air, but finally disappeared by June 1980. I was lucky enough, I happened to be in Limerick the day it opened, and I do have recordings of the first day. One of the big stations was Big L, which was located right beside us on Ellen Street. In fact, the building that has Portobello Jewellers is where Big L was located, and they had part of their equipment up here on the roof of this building. They began broadcasting on July 19th, 1978, using a converted shortwave transmitter they had purchased in London. But again, like the others, R.L.W.E and Capital Radio, within a week of going on air, they were raided. All their essential equipment was taken, including their transmitter, which required another trip to London to buy a new transmitter, which they smuggled into Belfast and then across the Northern Ireland border on what was known as unmarked routes, used at the time by some of the show bands that were travelling north and south. Taken in the raid and marked as evidence in the court case was a SM58 microphone, a single record, namely Everlasting Love by Love Affair, a record player, a Shrew 75 cartridge player, which operated as the left-hand deck, and a Millbank Disco 3 mixer, and of course the transmitter itself. In 1979, Big L were fined a maximum of £50 for illegal broadcasting. But unlike most of them, they were fined a further £50 when they refused to give an undertaking that they would not broadcast again. By August 1978, Big L was on the air 12 hours a day and became an instant success with listeners and advertisers. The station had some of the major companies in Ireland at the time advertising with them, like Guinness, Dunstores, the Sunday Tribune and Pennies. Again, please remember, this is illegal broadcasting. This is pirate radio. But yet all of these corporate companies are advertising with a pirate radio station rather than with the national station. The station had been founded by Mike Richardson and Heyman Harris, who was the nephew of the Irish actor Richard Harris. The station closed in 1985, and during his lifetime included a revenue commissioner's tax demand, the first ever revenue tax demand on a pirate radio station, which they based on their advertising revenue. You can see Ellen Street here. On the top left is the studio. These are Mike Richardson outside the studio, and that's what it is today, Portobello. And you can see their Big L outside broadcast unit now outside the pub. Independent Radio Limerick could be found in 256 and was located in Carhartavon on the outside of the city. IRL was on the air from 1978 to 1981. John Frawley, who would later operate Radio Limni, was involved with Independent Radio Limerick. At the time, both IRL and Capital Radio Limerick were located on medium wave, right beside each other, and at times they ended up jamming each other. Then there was Downtown Radio Limerick on 257, a small but short-lived Limerick station. There were a number of stations that came from the same lineage. Like pirate radio, it becomes a little complicated trying to follow the tracks. They started off with Radio Amanda on 271 in 1978, founded by Bernard Rooney and John Ryan. And this later would change name to the Limerick Broadcasting Company in 1979-1980. That station was raided in 1979. Other stations in that line were Radio Nova and Radio Phoenix and Radio Munster. This is the site of Radio Nova at the time, and the DJ even has a Radio Nova t-shirt on him. I don't know who remembers Hits 954 on 954 kilohertz, rather than calling it was very American to call it kilohertz rather than medium wave. And on 101 FM, broadcasting from the top floor of 99 O'Connell Street. Hits went on the air in 1987 after broadcasting non-stop hits as a test transmission on an excellent FM transmitter. The station, however, was short-lived and closed in April 1988 after some of the staff left to move to Galway and work on Coast 103. The Limerick frequencies later became a relay for Coast 103, which was then renamed as Coast Hot Hits 103. Midwest Radio 98 FM was based here and was operated by Mike Richardson from 1985 to 1986 above Hogan's Bar. Radio Galty on 100. Now, this version of the station closed in 1988 in accordance with the new Wireless Telegraphy Act, and had been on for a number of years in the Limerick region. The station then, however, came back on air after the laws were installed when they didn't get a franchise from the IRTC, as it was at the time, now the BAI. But they were rated on December 11th, 1988, then broadcasting on 102.4. They were rated yet again in 2003 and disappeared from the airwaves. Now, the grandiose title, the Munster Broadcasting Corporation, was another Limerick pirate. John Walsh of the NUIG and is the host of the excellent Wireless on Flirt FM. You can get it online. He recalled, "I called to the tiny attic studio of MBC, the Munster Broadcasting Corporation on Catron Street, an altogether more modest setup despite the ridiculous name. A corporation it wasn't, and it certainly didn't broadcast to the whole of Munster. Although there were some ads from Tipperary, and they claimed to have 3 FM frequencies covering Limerick, Clare and Tipperary. There was nothing remarkable about the music on MBC. It was the usual diet of top 40. But it was the presenter, calling himself Will Rogers, who really made an impact. He did the lunchtime show and also voiced most of the ads and the jingles in a strange mid-Atlantic accent that gained a cult status in our household, meaning John Walsh's household, for many years afterwards. Not all stations, even with the grandiose intention of MBC, made it on air. This is an ad for South West Radio Limerick from 1981, looking for all kinds of personnel, but never went on air. This is from the Evening Press in 1981. West County Radio, on 96 and 102, opened in November 1986 and was based in studios in Abbeyfield in County Limerick. They had a 96 FM frequency, also based in Mallow in County Cork. WCR closed in accordance with the Wireless Telegraphy Act in 1988. Other smaller stations in Limerick included the short-lived Radio Greenhills, who could be found on 243 metres and 99 FM. WSPD, which was heard in 273 and 102, broadcasting from studios on O'Connell Street. And despite a very extensive advertisement campaign in national newspapers like the Sunday World, WSPD went on the air in January 1986 but closed 2 months later. WPCR was heard in November 1988 and closed again in December 1988 in accordance with the Wireless Telegraphy Act. The name of the station came from the area where it was located, Prospect Hill Community Radio, WPCR, using the American jingle package of WPCR. The Sound Channel in Limerick began test transmissions in November 1986 and went on the air from studios located at 78 O'Connell Street in December of that year. The station closed at 7 p.m. on December 30th, 1988 in advance of the introduction of the new Wireless Act. If you want to hear the final 2 hours of the broadcast, you can go to radiowaves.fm and you can hear their close down. This is City Centre Radio, which broadcast on 103 from studios located at the corner of Parnell Street. The station began broadcasting in 1985 and at one point was known under various guises, but always seemed to regress to City Centre Radio. I think it was the occasional split in the station. It closed in December 1988, like many of them, stations across the country when the new law was enacted. These photographs come from Anorex Ireland, the Anorex Ireland collection, which was donated to Dublin City University last year. And of course, one of the most popular, famous and perhaps infamous stations in Limerick was Radio Limerick, originally on 230 and 106 and later on 265 and 96 FM. And this was one of the most popular, eccentric and innovative stations ever to have broadcast to Limerick. John Frawley was a popular presenter, and his original breakfast show on R.L.W.E. He presented the original breakfast show on R.L.W.E. until he left to found Radio Limerick. Originally titled Radio Limerick, Frawley was a patriot and a nationalist and immediately renamed the station as Radio Limerick. Like the other three stations in Limerick at the time, Limerick was raided in November 1979 and Frawley was fined £25. But the judge at the case said, everybody seems to be pleased with these local radio stations, but they must operate within the law. That didn't change until he closed in December 1988. The station was originally located on William Street before moving above Loughnan's Butchers on the corner of William Street and Griffin Street. Again, these are some of the pictures that have come to the archive from Anorex Ireland collection. The station was heavily influenced by religion and broadcast De Angelis every day. Frawley Station was the first in the country to begin reading out death notices at the top of the hour.
On Wednesday and Thursday, and the NIHE, tough audience, NIHE, that's the university in Limerick, the young crowd.
Piece of cake.
Piece of cake, really, piece of cake.
Oh,
young people.
University?
Sunday. Yeah, really, you go. They love you, do they, Billy?
I'm just saying that. I'm trying to encourage you. I never heard of it. Have you ever heard of Radio Limerick?
Oh yes, I've heard Radio Limerick.
I love it.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Brilliant.
There's a fellow on Radio Limerick, and he reads out the death notices in the morning. He says, so-and-so is dead. And he goes through the whole thing.
It's the best radio station in the world.
And then he says, thank God it's nobody we know. On Wednesday and Thursday.
The station was heavily influenced by religion and broadcast De Angelis every day. Frawley Station was the first in the country to begin reading out death notices at the top of the hour. Initially, Frawley took the notices from the local newspaper before local undertakers began to pay him to read the ads out at the top of the hour. On many local stations, the practice still continues today. The station closed on December 23rd, 1988, with the last tune being played was Dennis Allen's Limerick You're a Lady. At one stage, John Frawley stood in a general election, no chance of winning, but he reckoned it was the best £100 he ever spent on advertising. Unfortunately, John the man passed away 6 months later after the introduction of the Wireless Telegraphy Act, and he never saw independent radio in Limerick. Of course, the introduction of that new Wireless Telegraphy Act in 1988 was to lead to the closure of most of the pirates across the country. And it introduced legal, independent, commercial and community radio. But like all good things, pirate radio never went away. The IRTC awarded the Limerick franchise to Radio Limerick 1. They went on the air in October 1989. But a decade later, they were replaced by Limerick 95. However, R.L.W.E continued to broadcast via a UK satellite service and was rebroadcasted around Limerick on a pirate FM network. They also added a pirate television channel, R.L.W.E TV, and if you're ever looking for clips of it, you'll find lots of them on YouTube. Again, they suffered. The government chose to raid the rebroadcasters rather than trying to close R.L.W.E directly. Radio Vera was a sister station of Radio Munster, operated by Bernard Rooney. The station began broadcasting on January 3rd, 1988, and closed again at 6 p.m. on the 31st of that year, again in alignment with the new Wireless Telegraphy Act being introduced. The final tune played on that, which probably is rarely done now, was the national anthem. despite the introduction of the new Wireless Telegraphy Act, and despite the fact that fines now increased from £50 to £10,000, which was not aimed just at the operator but also aimed at anybody who provided land for a transmitter or anybody who advertised in the station, surprisingly enough, pirate radio still continued. DRK on 105 was a Limerick station that operated from 1998 to 1999. One of the station's jingles poked fun at its own name. What does DRK stand for? Don't know really. But it was actually located in Duganmore, Knockney and Roxborough, DKR. Kiss FM opened on August 19th, 1999, and one of the main backers was a local businessman. Finances for the station was generated, like many of the pirates, especially in Dublin, were generated because they couldn't take advertising. They were generated by club nights, nightclub nights, and that's how they generated their money. The station's launch was reported in local media, and the local legal station, Live 95, said that they didn't see KISS as a great threat. Its audience was predominantly teenagers and students. Q101 opened in 1995, with Liam Collins as being one of the main presenters. They were a country and western station, as was Estuary FM, but it was raided by Department of Post and Telegraphs, much to the annoyance of the locals. It seemed to be very popular at the time, again, providing that niche type of music that the local franchises weren't able to do. Shine FM was a dance station, again, dance music not catered for by the franchises that were awarded. It was a short-lived station in 1999, as was Enterprise FM. One of its presenters remembered there was always 3 Hail Marys keeping the station on the air, and you had a high risk of being electrocuted just walking into the studio. Now, and finally, in case you think that I've only mentioned 1 or 2 stations, and you might recognise a few of these names, these are a list of the stations that I have chronicled as being Limerick pirates, and you might recognise a few of them. You might have even listened, and maybe 1 or 2 might have worked on them. That's just one side. This is a small city with that amount of pirate radio. Just as when I came down today, I had assumed mistakenly, which will give away my next slide, that I spoke to Liam earlier and he kindly pointed my error in my ways. In Dublin we have what is known as pirate DAB. So at one time digital audio broadcasting was issued to RTE, and RTE decided it wasn't worth following, despite the fact that from this year across Europe all cars have to carry the facility to listen to DAB. RTE decided not. So there was a pirate DAB system set up in Dublin, and the guy who runs it has said that he set up a number of rebroadcasting across the country, which included Limerick, but I'm told it's not on. And when I came down today, like a good anorak that I am, the first thing I done when I came down was I done a band scan, and it wasn't there, but it's seemingly not there. But there is seemingly a wee pirate somewhere in the city. If I've missed anything, or if I've incorrectly stated something, I'm only too happy to correct it. If you have anybody who knows any interest in pirate radio or has archives, I would be only too happy to take it. I am the curator at the Irish Pirate Radio Archive at DCU, and I want to thank a lot of people who have helped in curating pirate radio history, which to me is hugely colourful, hugely important. The likes of Pirate.ie and Radio Waves FM and DX Archive are just huge resources. I've used the Irish Newspaper Archives, the Anarch Ireland Collection, the Big L page, Liam Byrne, Mike Richardson, Dublin City University, the Offshore Museum, and of course here, Ormston House. Thank you.